Well, hello everyone. Good evening to you. Come on in. Come on in and sit around the fire with us. You're going to sit a little closer tonight. It's down into the 20s. It's going to be dry. We don't have any snow, but by golly, it's cool, good and cool. So we're just going to build that fire up nice and big. Then we'll get something to drink to warm up the insides of you. Then, of course, like we do, we're going to tell stories. In fact, I started telling you that story about the Scarlet Plague, the Jack London story. Well, tonight I want to start again on chapter 3, and I think we can finish it up. It's an interesting story. There's some parallels there in our lives. Of course, this was written long enough back that the dates are going to be a little bit different. You're going to look at it and think, 2013, why, that's not what happened. That wasn't that long ago. Well, when this was written, it was quite a ways into the future. So you'll understand it. Chapter 3. The old man wiped the tears away on his grimy knuckles and took up the tale in a tremulous, piping voice that soon strengthened as he got the swing of the narrative. Well, it was the summer of 2013 that the plague came. I was 27 years old, and well do I remember it. Wireless dispatches. Well, old Hare-Lip spat loudly his disgust, and Granzer hastened to make amends. See, we talked through the air in those days, thousands and thousands of miles, and the word came of a strange disease that had broken out in New York. There were 17 million people then living in the noblest city of America. Nobody thought anything about the news. It was only a small thing. There had only been a few deaths. It seemed, though, that they had died very quickly, and that one of the first signs of the disease was the turning red of the face and all of the body. Within 24 hours came the report of the first case in Chicago. And on that same day, it was made public that London, the greatest city in the world next to Chicago, had been secretly fighting the plague for 2 weeks and censoring the news dispatches. That is, not permitting the word to go forth to the rest of the world that London had the plague. It looked serious, but we here in California, like everywhere else, we weren't alarmed. We were sure that the bacteriologists could find a way to overcome this new germ, just as they had overcome other germs in the past. But the trouble was the astonishing quickness with which this germ destroyed human beings, and the fact that it inevitably killed any human body it entered. No one ever recovered. There was an old Asiatic cholera when you might eat dinner with a well man in the evening, and the next morning, if you got up early enough, you would see him being hauled by your window in the death cart. But this new plague was quicker than that, much quicker. From the moment of the first signs of it, a man would be dead in an hour. Some lasted for several hours, but many died within 10 or 15 minutes of the appearance of the first signs. The heart, it began to beat faster, and the heat of the body increased. Then came that scarlet rash, spreading like wildfire over the face and the body. Most persons never even noticed the increase in heat and the heartbeat, and the first they knew was when the scarlet rash came out. And usually they had convulsions at the time of the appearance of the rash, but these convulsions didn't last long and were not very severe. If one lived through them, it became perfectly quiet. And only did he feel a numbness swiftly creeping up his body from the feet. The heels became numb first, then the legs, the hips, and when that numbness reached as high as his heart, he died. They did not rave or sleep. Their minds always remained cool and calm up to the moment their heart numbed and stopped. And another strange thing was the rapidity of decomposition. No sooner was a person dead than the body seemed to just fall to pieces, to fly apart, to melt away even as you looked at it. That was one of the reasons the plague spread so rapidly, and all the billions of germs in a corpse were so immediately released. And it was because of all this that the bacteriologists had so little chance in fighting the germs. They were killed in their laboratories even as they studied the germ of the Scarlet Death. Now, they were heroes. As fast as they perished, others stepped forth and took their places. It was in London that they first isolated it. The news was telegraphed everywhere. Trask was the name of the man who succeeded in this, but within 30 hours, he was dead. Then came the struggle in all the laboratories to find something that would kill the plague germs. All drugs failed. You see, the problem was to get a drug or serum that would kill the germs in the body and not kill the body. They tried to fight it with other germs, to put into the body of a sick man germs that were the enemies of the plague germs. And you can't see these germ things, Granzer, Hare-Lip objected. And here you gabble about them as if they was anything, when they're nothing at all. Anything you can't see ain't, and that's what? Fighting things that ain't with things that ain't. They must have been fools in them days. That's why they croaked. I ain't going to believe in such rot, I'd tell you that. Granzer promptly began to weep, while Edwin hotly took up his defense. Look here, Hare-Lip. You believe in lots of things you can't see. Hare-Lip shook his head. You believe in dead men walking about. You ain't never seen one dead man walk about. I tell you I seen 'em last winter when I was wolf hunting with Dad. Well, you always spit when you cross running water, Edwin challenged. Well, that's to keep off bad luck, was Hare-Lip's defense. When you believe in bad luck, sure. And you ain't never seen bad luck, Edwin concluded triumphantly. You're just as bad as Granzer and his germs. You believe in what you don't see. Well, go on, Granzer. Hare-Lip, crushed by this metaphysical defeat, remained silent, and the old man went on. Often and often, though this narrative must not be clogged by the details, was Granzer's tale interrupted, while the boys quabbled among themselves. Also among themselves, they kept up a constant low-voiced exchange of explanation and conjecture, as they strove to follow the old man into this unknown and vanished world. The Scarlet Death broke out in San Francisco. The first death came on a Monday morning. By Thursday, they were dying like flies in Oakland and San Francisco. They died everywhere, in their beds, at their work, and walking along the streets. It was on Tuesday that I saw my first death. Miss Colburn, one of my students, sitting right there before my eyes in my lecture room. I noticed her face while I was talking. It suddenly turned, scarlet. I ceased to speaking and could only look at her, for the first fear of the plague was already on all of us, and we knew that it had come. The young woman screamed and ran out of the room. So did the young men run out, all but two. Miss Colburn's convulsions were very mild, lasted less than a minute. One of the young men fetched her a glass of water. She drank, only a little of it, and she cried out, "My feet! All sensation has left them." And after a minute she said, "I have no feet. I am unaware that I have any feet, and my knees are cold. I can scarcely feel that I have knees." She lay down on the floor, a bundle of notebooks under her head, and we could do nothing for her. The coldness and the numbness crept up past her hips to her heart. When it reached her heart, she was dead. 15 minutes by the clock, I timed it, and she was dead. There, in my own classroom, dead. And she was a very beautiful, strong, healthy young woman. And from the first sign of the plague to her death, only 15 minutes elapsed. Now that'll show you how swift was the Scarlet Death. Yet in those few minutes, I remained with the dying woman in my classroom. The alarm had spread over the university, and the students, by the thousands, all of them, had deserted the lecture rooms and the laboratories. And when I emerged on my way to make a report to the president of the faculty, I found that the university was deserted. Across the campus were several stragglers hurrying for their homes. Two of them were running. President Hogue I found in his office, all alone, looking very old and very gray, with a multitude of wrinkles in his face that I'd never really seen before. And at the sight of me, he pulled himself to his feet and he tottered away to the inner office, banging the door after him and locking it. You see, he knew I had been exposed, and he was afraid. He shouted to me through the door to go away. I shall never forget my feelings as I walked down the silent corridors and out across that deserted campus. I was not afraid. I'd been exposed, and I looked upon myself as already dead. It was not that, but a feeling of awful depression that came. impressed me. Everything had stopped. It was like the end of the world to me, my world. I'd been born within sight and sound of that university. It had been my predestined career. My father had been a professor there before me, and his father before him. For a century and a half had this university, like a splendid machine, been running steadily on, and now, in an instant, it had stopped. It was like seeing the sacred flame die down on some thrice sacred altar. I was shocked, unutterably shocked. When I arrived home, my housekeeper screamed as I entered and fled away. And when I rang, I found the housemaid had likewise fled. I investigated. In the kitchen, I found the cook on the point of departure, but she screamed too, and in her haste dropped a suitcase of her personal belongings and ran out of the house and across the grounds, still screaming. I can hear her scream to this very day. You see, we did not act in this way when ordinary diseases smote us. We were always calm over such things and sent for the doctors and the nurses who knew just what to do. This was different. It struck so suddenly and killed so swiftly, and never missed a stroke. When the scarlet rash appeared on a person's face, that person was marked by death. There was never a known case of recovery. I was alone in my big house. As I've often told you, in those days we could talk with one another over wires or through the air. So the telephone bell rang and I found my brother talking to me. Now, he told me that he was not coming home for fear of catching the plague from me, and that he had taken our two sisters to stop at Professor Bacon's house. He advised me to remain where I was and to wait to find out whether or not I'd caught the plague. To all of this I agreed, staying in my house and for the first time in my life attempting to cook. And the plague did not come out on me. By means of the telephone I could talk with whomsoever I pleased and get the news. Also, there were the newspapers, and I ordered all of them to be thrown up to my door so that I would know what was happening with the rest of the world. New York City and Chicago, they were in chaos. And what happened with them was happening in all the large cities. A third of the New York Police Department were dead. Their chief was also dead, likewise the mayor. All law and order had ceased. The bodies were lying in the streets unburied. All railroads and vessels carrying food and such things to the great city had ceased running, and the mobs of the hungry poor were pillaging the stores and the warehouses. Murder, robbery, and drunkenness were everywhere. Already the people had fled from the city by the millions. At first, the rich in their private motor cars and dirigibles, and then the great mass of the population, on foot, carrying the plague with them, themselves starving and pillaging the farmers and all the towns and villages along the way. The man who sent that news, the wireless operator, was alone with his instrument on the top of a lofty building. The people remaining in the city, he estimated them at several 100,000, had gone mad from fear and drink, and on all sides of him great fires were raging. He was a hero, that man who stayed by his post, an obscure newspaperman most likely. For 24 hours, he said, no transatlantic airships had arrived, and no more messages were coming from England. He did state, though, that a message from Berlin, that's in Germany, announced that Hofmeier, a bacteriologist of the Michkikoff School, had discovered the serum for the plague. And that was the last word, to this very day, that we of America ever received from Europe. If Hofmeier discovered the serum, it was too late, or otherwise, long ere this, explorers from Europe would have come looking for us. We can only conclude that what happened in America happened in Europe too, and that at the best, some several score may have survived the Scarlet Death on that whole continent. For one day longer, the dispatches continued to come from New York. Then they, too, ceased. The man who had sent them, perched in his lofty building, had either died of the plague or been consumed in the great conflagrations he had described as raging around him. And what had occurred in New York had been duplicated in all the other cities. It was the same in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley, and by Thursday, The people were dying so rapidly that their corpses could not be handled, and dead bodies just laid everywhere. Thursday night, the panic outrush for the country began. Imagine, my grandsons, people thicker than the salmon run you've seen on the Sacramento River poured out of the cities by the millions, madly over the country, in vain attempt to escape the ubiquitous death. You see, they carried the germs with them. Even the airships of the rich, fleeing from mountains and desert fastness, carried the germs. Hundreds of these airships escaped to Hawaii, and not only did they bring the plague with them, but they found the plague already there before them. This we learned by the dispatches, until all order in San Francisco had vanished, and there were no operators left at their posts to receive or send. It was amazing, astounding, this loss of communication with the world. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, just been blotted out. For 60 years, that world has no longer existed for me. I know there must be such places as New York, Europe, Asia, Africa, but not one word has been heard from them. Not in 60 years. With the coming of the Scarlet Death, the world fell apart, absolutely fell apart, irretrievably. 10,000 years of culture and civilization passed in the twinkling of an eye, lapsed like foam. I was telling about the airships of the rich. Well, they carried the plague with them, and no matter where they fled, they died. I never encountered but one survivor of any of them, Mungerson. Mungerson he was. He was afterwards a Santa Rosan, and he married my eldest daughter. He came into the tribe 8 years after the plague. He was then 19 years old, and he was compelled to wait 12 years more before he could marry. You see, there were no unmarried women, and some of the oldest daughters of the Santa Rosans were already bespoken, so he was forced to wait until my Mary had grown to 16 years. It was his son, Gimpleg, who was killed last year by that mountain lion. Now, Mungerson was 11 years old at the time of the plague. His father was one of the industrial magnates, a very wealthy, powerful man. And it was on his airship, the Condor, that they were fleeing with all the family for the wilds of British Columbia, which is far to the north of here. But there was some accident, and they were wrecked near Mount Shasta. You've heard of that mountain. It's pretty far to the north. The plague broke out amongst them, and this boy of 11 was the only survivor. For 8 years he was alone and wandering over a deserted land and looking vainly for his own kind. And at last, traveling south, he picked up with us, the Santa Rosans. But I'm ahead of my story. When the great exodus from the cities around San Francisco Bay began, and while the telephones were still working, I talked with my brother. I told him this flight from the cities was insanity, and that there were no symptoms of the plague in me, and that the thing for us to do was to isolate ourselves and our relatives in some safe place. We decided on the chemistry building at the university, and we planned to lay in a supply of provisions and by force of arms to prevent any other person from forcing their presence upon us after we had retired to our refuge. Now, all this being arranged, my brother begged me to stay in my own house for at least 24 hours more, on the chance of the plague developing inside of me. To this I agreed, and he promised to come for me the very next day. We talked on over the details of the provisioning and the defending of the chemistry building until the telephone died. It died in the midst of our conversation. That evening, there were no electric lights, and I was alone in my house in the darkness. No more newspapers were being printed, so I had no knowledge of what was taking place outside. Now I heard sounds of rioting, of pistol shots, and from my windows I could see the glare of the sky of some conflagration in the direction of Oakland. It was a night of terror. I did not sleep a wink. A man, why and how I do not know, was killed on the sidewalk in front of the house. I heard the rapid reports of an automatic pistol, and a few minutes later the wounded wretch crawled up to my door, moaning and crying out for help. Arming myself with 2 automatics, I went out to him, and by the light of a match, I ascertained that while he was dying of the bullet wounds, at the same time the plague was on him. I fled indoors, whence I heard him moan and cry out for half an hour longer. In the morning, my brother came to me. I had gathered into a handbag what things of value I proposed in taking, but when I saw his face, I knew that he would never accompany me to the chemistry building. The plague was on him. He intended shaking my hand, but I went back hurriedly before him. "Look at yourself in the mirror," I commanded. He did so, and at sight of his scarlet face, the color deepening as he looked at it, he sank down nervously in a chair. "My God," he said, "I've got it. Don't come near me. I'm a dead man." Then the convulsions seized him. He was 2 hours in dying, and he was conscious to the last, complaining about the coldness and the loss of sensation in his feet, his calves, his thighs, until at last it was his heart, and he was dead. And that was the way the Scarlet Death slew. I caught up my handbag and I flew. The sights in the streets were terrible. One stumbled on bodies everywhere. Some were not yet dead. And even as you looked, you saw men sink down with the death fastened upon them. There were numerous fires burning in Berkeley, while Oakland and San Francisco were apparently being swept by vast conflagrations. The smoke of the burning filled the heavens, so that the midday was as gloomy twilight, and in the shifts of wind sometimes the sun shone through dimly, a dull red orb. Truly, my grandsons, it was like the last days of the end of the world. There were numerous stalled motor cars, showing that the gasoline and the engine supplies of the garage had given out. I remember one such car. A man and a woman lay back dead in their seats, and on the pavement nearby were 2 more women and a child. Strange and terrible sights there were on every hand. People slipped by silently, furtively, like ghosts. White-faced women carrying infants in their arms, fathers leading children by the hand, singly, and in couples, and in families, all fleeing out of the city of death. Some carried supplies of food, others blankets and valuables, and there were many who carried nothing. There was a grocery store, a place where food was sold. The man to whom it belonged, I knew him well. A quiet, sober, but stupid and obstinate fellow was defending it. The windows and the doors had been broken in, but he, inside, hiding behind a counter, was discharging his pistol at a number of men on the sidewalk who were breaking in. In the entrance were several bodies, of men, I decided, whom he had killed earlier in the day. Even as I looked on from a distance, I saw one of the robbers break the windows of the adjoining store, a place where shoes were sold, and deliberately set fire to it. I did not go to the groceryman's assistance. The time for such acts had already passed. Civilization was crumbling, and it was each for himself. Chapter 4. I went away hastily, down a cross street, and at the first corner I saw another tragedy. 2 men of the working class had caught a man and a woman with 2 children, and they were robbing them. I knew the man by sight, though I'd never been introduced to him. He was a poet whose verses I had long admired. Yet I did not go to his help, for at that very moment I came upon the scene. There was a pistol shot, and I saw him sinking to the ground. The woman screamed, and she was felled with a fist blow by one of the brutes. I cried out threateningly, whereupon they discharged their pistols at me, and I ran away around the corner. Here I was blocked by an advancing conflagration. The buildings on both sides were burning, and the street was filled with smoke and flame, and from somewhere in that murk came a woman's voice calling shrilly for help. But I did not go to her. A man's heart turns to iron amid such scenes, and one heard all too many appeals for help. Returning to the corner, I found the 2 robbers were gone. The poet and his wife lay dead on the pavement. It was a shocking sight. The 2 children had vanished. Whither, I could not tell, and I knew now why it was that the fleeing person I encountered slipped along so furtively and with such white faces. In the midst of our civilization, down in our slums and labor ghettos, we had bred a race of barbarians, of savages, and now, In the time of our calamity, they turned upon us like the wild beasts that they were, and they destroyed us. And they destroyed themselves as well. They inflamed themselves with strong drink and committed 1,000 atrocities, quarreling and killing one another in the general madness. One group of working men I saw, of the better sort, who had banded together and, with their women and children in their midst, the sick and aged in litters and being carried, and with a number of horses pulling a truckload of provisions, they were fighting their way out of the city. They made a fine spectacle as they came down the street through the drifting smoke. And though they nearly shot me when I first appeared in their path, as they went by, one of their leaders shouted out to me an apologetic explanation. He said they were killing the robbers and the looters on sight, and that they had thus banded together as the only means by which to escape the prowlers. It was here that I saw for the first time what I was soon to see so often. One of the marching men had suddenly shown the unmistakable mark of the plague. Immediately those about him drew away, and he, without a remonstrance, stepped out of his place to let them pass on. A woman, most probably his wife, attempted to follow him. She was leading a little boy by the hand, but the husband commanded her sternly to go on, while others laid hands on her and restrained her from following him. This I saw. And I saw the man also, with his scarlet blaze of face, step into a doorway on the opposite side of the street. I heard the report of his pistol, and I saw him sink lifeless to the ground. After being turned aside twice again by advancing fires, I succeeded in getting through to the university. On the edge of the campus, I came upon a party of university folk who were going in the direction of the chemistry building. They were all family men. Their families were with them, including the nurses and the servants. Professor Badminton greeted me. I had difficulty in recognizing him. Somewhere he had gone through flames, and his beard had been singed off. About his head was a bloody bandage, and his clothes were filthy. He told me he had prowlers, and that his brother had been killed the previous night in the defense of their dwelling. Midway across the campus, he pointed suddenly to Mrs. Swinton's face. The unmistakable Scarlet was there. Immediately, all the other women set up screaming and began to run away from her. Her 2 children were with a nurse, and these also ran with the women. But her husband, Dr. Swinton, remained with her. "Go on, Smith," he told me. "Keep an eye on the children. As for me, I shall stay with my wife. I know she is already dead, but I can't leave her. Afterwards, if I escape, I shall come to the chemistry building, and do you watch for me and let me in." I left him bending over his wife and soothing her last moments, while I ran to overtake the party. We were the last to be admitted to the chemistry building. After that, with our automatic rifles, we maintained our isolation. By our plans, we had arranged for a company of 60 to be in this refuge. Instead, every one of the number originally planned had added relatives and friends and whole families until there were over 400 souls. But the chemistry building was large, and standing by itself, was in no real danger of being burned by the great fires that raged everywhere in the city. A large quantity of provisions had been gathered, and a food committee took charge of it, issuing rations daily to the various families and groups that arranged themselves into messes. A number of committees were appointed, and we developed a very efficient organization. I was on the committee of defense, though for the first day no prowlers came near. We could see them in the distance, however, and by the smoke of their fires knew that several camps of them were occupying the far edges of the campus. Drunkenness was rife, and often we heard them singing ribald songs or insanely shouting. While the world crashed to ruin about them and all the air was filled with the smoke of its burning, these low creatures gave rein to their bestiality and fought and drank and died. And after all, what did it matter? Everybody died anyway, and the good and the bad and the efficients and the weaklings and those that loved to live and those that scorned to live, they passed. Everything passed. When 24 hours had gone by and no signs of the plague were apparent, we congratulated ourselves and set about digging a well. You see, We have seen the great iron pipes, which in those days carried water to all the city dwellers. We feared that the fires in the city would burst the pipes and empty the reservoir. So we tore up the cement floor of the central court of the chemistry building and dug a well. There were many young men, undergraduates, with us, and we worked night and day on the well, and our fears were confirmed. 3 hours before we reached water, the pipes went dry. A second 24 hours passed, and still the plague did not appear among us. We thought we were saved. But we did not know what I afterwards decided to be true, namely, that the period of the incubation of the plague germs in a human's body was a matter of a number of days. It slew so swiftly when once it manifested itself that we were led to believe that the period of incubation was really quick. So when 2 days had left us unscathed, we were elated with the idea that we were free of the contagion. But the third day disillusioned us. I can never forget the night preceding it. I had charge of the night guards from 8 to 12, and from the roof of the building I watched the passing of all man's glorious works. So terrible were the local conflagrations that the sky was lighted up. One could read the finest print in the red glare. All the world seemed wrapped in flames. San Francisco spouted smoke and fire from a score of vast conflagrations that were like so many active volcanoes. Oakland, San Leandro, Hayward, all were burning. And to the northward, clear to Point Richmond, other fires were at work. It was an awe-inspiring spectacle. Civilization, my grandson, civilization was passing in a sheet of flame and a breath of death. Around 10 o'clock that night, the great powder magazines at Point Pinole exploded in rapid succession. So terrific were the concussions that the strong building rocked as if in an earthquake, while every pane of glass was broken. It was then that I left the roof, went down the long corridors from room to room, quieting the alarmed women and telling them what had happened. An hour later, at a window on the ground floor, I heard pandemonium break out in the camps of the prowlers. There were cries and screams and shots from many pistols. As we afterwards conjectured, this fight had been precipitated by an attempt on the part of those that were very well to drive out those that were sick. At any rate, a number of the plague-stricken prowlers escaped across the campus and drifted against our doors. We warned them back, but they cursed us and discharged a fusillade from their pistols. Professor Merriweather at one of the windows was instantly killed, the bullet striking him squarely between the eyes. We opened fire in return, and all the prowlers fled away with the exception of 3. One was a woman. The plague was on them, and they were reckless, like foul fiends there in the red glare from the skies, with faces blazing. They continued to curse us and fire at us. One of the men I shot with my own hand. After that, the other man and the woman, still cursing us, lay down under our windows where we were compelled to watch them die of the plague. The situation was critical. The explosion of the powder magazines had broken all the windows of the chemistry building, so that we were exposed to the germs from the corpses. The sanitary committee was called upon to act, and it responded nobly. 2 men were required to go out and remove the corpses, and this meant the probable sacrifice of their own lives, for having performed the tasks, they were not permitted to re-enter the building. One of the professors, who was a bachelor, and one of the undergraduates volunteered. They bade goodbye to us and went forth. They were heroes. They gave up their lives that 400 others might live. And after they had performed their work, they stood for a moment at a distance, looking at us wistfully. Then they waved their hands in farewell and went away slowly across the campus towards the burning city. And yet it was all useless. The next morning, the first one of us was smitten with the plague. A little nurse girl in the family of Professor Stout. It was no time for weak-kneed sentimental policies. On the chance that she might be the only one, we thrust her forth from the building, commanded her to be gone. She went away slowly across the campus, wringing her hands and crying pitifully. We felt like brutes. But what were we to do? There were 400 of us, and individuals had to be sacrificed. In one of the laboratories, 3 families had domiciled themselves, and that afternoon we found among them no less than 4 corpses and 7 cases of the plague in all its different stages. Then it was that the horror began. Leaving the dead die, we forced the living ones to segregate themselves in another room. The plague began to break out among the rest of us, and as fast as the symptoms appeared, we sent the stricken ones to these segregated rooms. We compelled them to walk there by themselves to avoid laying hands on them. It was heartrending. But still, the plague raged among us, and the room after room was filled with the dead and the dying, and so we, who were yet clean, retreated to the next floor and to the next, before the sea of the dead that, room by room and floor by floor, inundated the building. The place became a charnel house, and in the middle of the night, the survivors fled forth, taking nothing with them except arms and ammunition and a heavy store of tinned foods. We camped on the opposite side of the campus from the prowlers, and while some stood guard, others of us volunteered to scout into the city in quest of horses, motor cars, carts, wagons, or anything that would carry our provisions and enable us to emulate the banded working man that I had seen fighting their way out to the open country. I was one of those scouts, and Dr. Hoyle, remembering that his motor car had been left behind in his home garage, told me to look for it. We scouted in pairs, and Dombey, a young undergraduate, accompanied me. We had to cross half a mile of the residence portion of the city to get to Dr. Hoyle's house. Here the buildings stood apart, in the midst of trees and grassy lawns, and here the fires had played freaks, burning whole blocks, skipping blocks, and often skipping a single house in a block. And here, too, the prowlers were still at their work. We carried our automatic pistols openly in our hands and looked desperate enough, forsooth, to keep them from attacking us. But at Dr. Hoyle's house, the thing happened. Untouched by fire, even as we came to it, we could see the smoke of flames burst forth. The miscreant who had set fire to it staggered down the steps and out along the driveway. Sticking out of his coat pockets were bottles of whiskey, and he was very drunk. My first impulse was to shoot him, and I have never ceased regretting that I did not. Staggering and maundering himself with bloodshot eye and a raw and bleeding slash down one side of his bewhiskered face, he was altogether the most nauseating specimen of degradation and filth that I had ever encountered. I did not shoot him, and he leaned against a tree on the lawn and let us go by. It was the most absolute wanton act. Just as we were opposite him, he suddenly drew a pistol and shot Dombey through the head. The very next instant, I shot him, but it was too late. Dombey had expired without a groan. Immediately. Now, I doubt if he ever knew what had even happened to him. Leaving the 2 corpses, I hurried on past the burning house to the garage, and there I found Dr. Hoyle's motor car. The tanks were filled with gasoline, and it was ready for use. And it was in this car that I threaded the streets of the ruined city and came back to the survivors on the campus. The other scouts returned, but none had been so fortunate. Professor Fairmead had found a Shetland pony, but the poor creature, tied in a stable and abandoned for days, was so weak from want of food and water that it could carry no burden at all. Some of the men were for turning it loose, but I insisted that we should lead it along with us so that if we got out of food, we would at least have it to eat. There were 47 of us when we started, many being women and children. The president of the faculty, an old man to begin with, was now hopelessly broken by the awful happenings of the past week, rode in the motor car with several young children and the aged mother of Professor Fairmead. Wathope, a young professor of English, who had a grievous bullet wound in his leg, drove the car. The rest of us walked, Professor Fairmead leading the pony. It was what should have been a bright summer day, but the smoke from the burning world filled the sky, through which the sun shone murkily, a dull and lifeless orb, blood red and ominous. But we had grown accustomed to that blood-red sun, and with the smoke it was different. It bit into our nostrils and our eyes. There was not one of us whose eyes were not bloodshot. We directed our course to the southeast through the endless miles of suburban residence, traveling along where the first swells of low hills rose from the flats of the central city. It was by this way only that we could expect to gain country. Our progress was painfully slow. The women and the children could not walk fast. They did not dream of walking, my grandsons, in the way all people walk today. In truth, none of us knew how to walk. It was not until after the plague that I learned really how to walk. So it was that the pace of the slowest was the pace of all of us, for we dared not separate on account of the prowlers. There were not so many now of these human beasts of prey. The plague had already well diminished their numbers, but enough still survived to be a constant menace to us. Many of the beautiful residences were untouched by fire, yet smoking ruins were everywhere. The prowlers, too, seemed to have got over their instimate desire to burn, and it was more rarely that we saw houses freshly on fire. Several of us scouted among the private garages in search of motor cars and gasoline, but in this we were unsuccessful. The first great flights from the cities had swept all such utilities away. Calgan, a fine young man, was lost in this work. He was shot by prowlers while crossing a lawn. Yet this was our only casualty, though once a drunken brute deliberately opened fire on all of us. Luckily, he fired wildly, and we shot him before he had done any hurt. Now at Fruitvale, still in the heart of the magnificent residence section of the city, the plague again smote us. Professor Fairmead was the victim, making signs to us that his mother was not to know. He turned aside into the grounds of a beautiful mansion. He sat down forlornly on the steps of the front veranda, and I, having lingered, waved him a last farewell. That night, several miles beyond Fruitvale and still in the city, we made camp. And that night we shifted camp twice to get away from our dead. In the morning, there were 30 of us. I shall never forget the president of the faculty. During the morning's march, his wife, who was walking, betrayed the fatal symptoms, and when she drew aside to let us go on, he insisted on leaving the motor car and remaining with her. There was quite a discussion about this, but in the end we gave in. It was just as well, for we knew not which ones of us, if any, might ultimately escape. That very night, the second of our march, we camped beyond Hayward's in the first stretches of country, and in the morning there were 11 of us that lived. Also during the night, Wathope, the professor with the wounded leg, deserted us in the motor car. He took with him his sister and his mother and most of our tinned provisions. It was that day in the afternoon, while resting by the wayside, that I saw the last airship I shall ever see. The smoke was much thinner here in the country, and I first sighted the ship drifting and veering helplessly at an elevation of 2,000 feet. What had happened I could not conjecture, but even as we looked, we saw her bow dip down lower and lower. Then the bulkheads of the various gas chambers must have burst, for quite perpendicular she fell like a plummet to the earth. And from that day to this, I have not seen another airship. Often and often during the next few years, I scanned the sky for them, hoping against hope that somewhere in the world civilization had survived. But it was not to be. What happened with us in California must have happened with everybody everywhere. Another day, and at Niles, there were 3 of us. Beyond Niles, in the middle of the highway, we found Wathope. The motor car had broken down, and there, on the rugs which they had spread on the ground, lay the bodies of his sister, his mother, and himself. Wearied by the unusual exercise of continual walking, that night I slept heavily. In the morning, I was alone in the world. Canfield and Parsons, my last companions, were dead of the plague. Of the 400 that sought shelter in the chemistry building, and of the 47 that began the march, I alone remained. I and the Shetland pony. Why this should be so, there is no explaining. I did not catch the plague, that is all. I was immune, I was merely the one lucky man in a million, just as every survivor was one in a million, or rather several millions, for the proportions was at least that. Chapter 5. For 2 days I sheltered in a pleasant grove where there had been no deaths. And in those 2 days, while badly depressed and believing that my turn would come at any moment, nevertheless I rested and I recuperated, and so did the pony. And on the 3rd day, putting what small store of tinned provisions I possessed on the pony's back, I started on across a very lonely land. Not a live man, woman, or child did I encounter, though the dead were everywhere. Food, however, was abundant. The land then was not as it is now. It was all cleared of trees and brush, and it was cultivated. The food for millions of mouths was growing, ripening, and going to waste. From the fields and the orchard I'd gathered vegetables and fruits and berries. Around the deserted farmhouses I got eggs, and I caught chickens, and frequently I found supplies of tinned provisions in storerooms. A strange thing that was taking place with all the domestic animals. Everywhere they were going wild and preying on one another. The chickens and the ducks were the first to be destroyed, while the pigs were the first to go wild, followed by the cats. Nor were the dogs long in adapting themselves to the changed conditions. There was a veritable plague of dogs. They devoured the corpses, barked and howled during the nights, and in the daytime slunk about in the distance. As the time went by, I noticed a change in their behavior. At first they were apart from one another, very suspicious, very prone to fight. But after a not very long time, they began to come together and run in packs. The dog, you see, always was a social animal, and this was true before ever he came to be domesticated by man. And in the last few days of the world before the plague, there were many very different kinds of dogs. Dogs without hair, dogs with warm fur, dogs so small that they would make scarcely a mouthful for other dogs that were as large as mountain lions. Well, all the small dogs in the weak type were killed by their fellows. Also, the very large ones were not adapted for the wildlife and bred out. As a result, the many different kinds of dogs disappeared, and there remained, running in packs, the medium-sized wolfish dogs that you know today. But the cats, they don't run in packs, Granzer who objected. Yeah, the cat was never a social animal. As one writer in the 19th century said, the cat walks by himself. He always walked by himself. From before the time he was tamed by man down through the long ages of domestication to today when once more he's wild. The horses, well, they also went wild. And all the fine breeds we had degenerated into the small Mustang horse you know today. The cows, likewise, they went wild. So did the pigeons and the sheep, and that a few of the chickens survived, you know yourself. But the wild chicken of today is quite a different thing from the chickens that we had in those days. But I must go on with my story. I traveled through a deserted land. As the time went by, I began to yearn more and more for human beings, but I never found one. And I grew lonelier and lonelier. I crossed Livermore Valley and the mountains between it and the great valley of the San Joaquin. You've never seen that valley, but it's very large, and it is the home of the wild horse. There are great droves there, thousands, and tens of thousands. I revisited it 30 years after, so I know. You think there's a lot of wild horses down here in the coast valleys, but they are nothing compared with those of the San Joaquin. Strange to say, the cows, when they went wild, went back into the lower mountains. Evidently, they were better able to protect themselves there. In the country districts, the ghouls and the prowlers had been less in evidence, for I found many villages and towns untouched by fire. But they were filled by the pestilential dead, and I passed by without exploring them. It was near Lathrop that, out of my loneliness, I picked up a pair of collie dogs that were so newly free that they were urgently willing to return to their allegiance to man. Now, these collies accompanied me for many years, and the strains of them are in those very dogs there that you boys have today. But in 60 years, the collie strain has worked out. These brutes are more like domesticated wolves than anything else. Hare-Lip rose to his feet, and glanced to see that the goats were safe and looked at the sun's position in the afternoon sky, advertising impatience at the prolixity of the old man's tale. Urged to hurry by Edwin, Granzer went on. There is little more to tell. With my 2 dogs and my pony, and riding a horse I had managed to capture, I crossed the San Joaquin and went on to a wonderful valley in the Sierras called Yosemite. In the great hotel there, I found a prodigious supply of tinned provisions. The pasture was abundant, as was the game, and the river that ran through that valley was full of trout. I remained there 3 years in an utter loneliness that none but a man who had once been highly civilized can understand. Then I could stand it no more. I felt that I was going crazy, and like the dog, I was a social animal and I needed my kind. I reasoned that since I had survived the plague, there was a possibility that others had survived. Also, I reasoned that after 3 years the plague germs must all be gone and the land be clean again. With my horse, my dogs, and my pony, I set out. Again I crossed the San Joaquin Valley and the mountains beyond and came down into Livermore Valley. The change in those 3 years was amazing. All the land had been splendidly tilled, and now I could scarcely recognize it. Such was the sea of rank vegetation that had overrun the agricultural handiwork of man. You see, the wheat, the vegetables, and the orchard trees had always been cared for and nursed by man, so that they were soft and tender. The weeds and the wild bushes and such things, on the contrary, had always been fought by man, so that they were tough and resilient. As a result, when the hand of man was removed, the wild vegetation smothered and destroyed practically all the domesticated vegetation. The coyotes were greatly increased, and it was at this time that I first encountered the wolves, straying in 2s and 3s and small packs down from the regions where they had always persisted. It was at Lake Temascal, not far from the one-time city of Oakland, that I came upon the first live human beings. Oh, my grandsons, how can I describe to you my emotion when, astride my horse and dropping down the hillside to the lake, I saw the smoke of a campfire rising through the trees. I almost did my heart stop beating. I felt that I was going crazy. Then I heard the cry of a babe, a human babe, and dogs barked, and my dogs answered. I did not know but what I was the one human alive in the whole world. It could not be true that here were others, and smoke, and the cry of a baby. Emerging on the lake there before my eyes, not 100 yards away, I saw a man, a large man. He was standing on an out-jutting rock and fishing. I was overcome. I stopped my horse. I tried to call out, but could not. I waved my hand. It seemed to me that the man looked at me, but he did not appear to wave. Then I laid my head on my arms there in the saddle. I was afraid to look again, for I knew it was a hallucination. And I knew that if I looked, the man would be gone. And so precious was the hallucination that I wanted it to persist just a little while. I knew, too, that as long as I did not look, it would persist. Thus I remained until I heard my dog snarling and a man's voice. What do you think the voice said? I'll tell you. It said, "Where in the hell did you come from?" Those were the words, the exact words. That was what your other grandfather said to me, Hare-Lip, when he greeted me there on the shore of Lake Temascal 57 years ago. And they were the most ineffable words I had ever heard. I opened my eyes, and there he stood before me, a large, dark, hairy man, heavy-jawed, slant-browed, fierce-eyed. How I got off my horse, I don't know, but it seemed that the next I knew I was clasping his hands with both of mine and crying. I would have embraced him, but he was ever a narrow-minded, suspicious man, and he drew away from me. Yet did I cling to his hand and cry. Granzer's voice faltered, and he broke at the recollection, and the weak tears streamed down his cheeks, while the boys looked on and giggled. Yet did I cry, he continued, and desire to embrace him, though the chauffeur was a brute, a perfect brute, the most abhorrent man I have ever known. His name was strange, I have forgotten his name. Everyone called him chauffeur. It was the name of his occupation, and it had stuck. And that is how, to this day, The tribe he founded is called the Chauffeur tribe. He was a violent, unjust man. Why the plague germ spared him, I can never understand. It would seem, in spite of our old metaphysical notions about absolute justice, that there is no justice in the universe. Why did he live? An iniquitous moral monster, a blot on the face of nature, a cruel, relentless, bestial cheat as well. All he could talk about was motor cars, machinery, gasoline, garages, and especially, and with huge delight, of his mean pilferings and sordid swindlings of the persons who had employed him in the days before the comings of the plague. And yet he was spared, while hundreds of millions, billions of better men were destroyed. I went on with him to his camp, and there I saw her, Vesta, the one woman. It was glorious and pitiful. There she was, Vesta Van Worden, the young wife of John Van Worden, clad in rags, which marred and scarred and toil-calloused hands, bending over the campfire and doing scullion work. She, Vesta, who had been born to the purple of the greatest baronage of wealth the world had ever known, John Van Worden, her husband, worth $1,800,000,000 and the president of the Board of Industrial Magnates, had been the ruler of America. Also, sitting on the International Board of Control, he had been one of the 7 men who ruled the world, and she herself had come of equally noble stock. Her father, Philip Saxon, had been president of the Board of Industrial Magnates up till the time of his death. This office was in process of becoming hereditary, and had Philip Saxon had a son, that son would have succeeded him. But his only child was Vesta, the perfect flower of generations of the highest culture this planet has ever produced. It was not until the engagement between Vesta and Van Worden took place that Saxon indicated the latter as his successor. It was, I am sure, a political marriage. I have reason to believe that Vesta never really loved her husband in the mad, passionate way of which the poets used to sing. It was more like the marriages that obtained among crowned heads in the days before they were displaced by the magnates. And there she was, boiling fish chowder in a soot-covered pot, her glorious eyes inflamed by the acrid smoke of the open fire. Hers was a sad story. She was the one survivor in a million, as I had been, as the chauffeur had been. On a crowning eminence of the Alameda Hills, overlooking San Francisco Bay, Van Worden had built a vast summer palace. It was surrounded by a park of 1,000 acres. When the plague broke out, Van Worden had sent her there. Armed guards patrolled the boundaries of the park, and nothing entered in the way of provisions or even mail matter that was not first fumigated. And yet did the plague enter, killing the guards at their posts, the servants at their tasks, sweeping away the whole army of retainers, or at least all of them who did not flee to die elsewhere. So it was that Vesta found herself the sole living person in the palace that had become a charnel house. Now the chauffeur had been one of the servants that ran away, and returning 2 months afterwards, he discovered Vesta in a little summer pavilion where there had been no deaths and where she had established herself. He was a brute. She was afraid, and she ran away and hid among the trees. And that night, on foot, she fled into the mountains. She, whose tender feet and delicate body had never known the bruise of stones nor the scratch of briars. He followed, and that night he caught her. He struck her. Do you understand? He beat her with those terrible fists of his and made her his slave. It was she who had to gather the firewood, build the fires, cook, do all the degrading camp labor. It was she who had never performed a menial act in her life. These things he compelled her to do, while he, a proper savage, elected to lie around camp and look on. He did nothing, absolutely nothing, except on occasion to hunt meat or catch fish. Good for chauffeur, Hare-Lip commented in an undertone to the other boys. I remember him before he died. He was a corker, but he did things, and he made things go. You know, Dad married his daughter, and you ought to see the way he knocked the spots out of Dad. The chauffeur was a son of a gun. He made us kids stand around. Even when he was croaking, he reached out for me once and laid my head open with that long stick he kept always beside him. Hare-Lip rubbed his bullet head reminiscently. The boys returned to the old man, who was maundering ecstatically about Vesta, the squaw of the founder of the chauffeur tribe. And so I say to you that you cannot understand the awfulness of the situation. The chauffeur was a servant. Understand, a servant. And he cringed with bowed head to such as she. She was a lord of life, both by birth and by marriage. The destinies of millions, such as he, she carried in the hollow of her pink-white hand. And in the days before the plague, the slightest contact with such as he would have been pollution. Oh, I have seen it. Once I remember there was Mrs. Goldwyn, wife of one of the great magnates. It was on a landing stage, just as she was disembarking in her private dirigible, that she dropped her parasol. A servant picked it up and made the mistake of handing it to her, one of the greatest royal ladies of the land. She shrank back as though he were a leper, and indicated her secretary to receive it. Also, she ordered her secretary to ascertain the creature's name and to see that he was immediately discharged from service. And such a woman was Vesta Van Worden, and her the chauffeur beat and made his slave. Bill, that was it, Bill the chauffeur. That was his name. He was a wretched, primitive man, wholly devoid of the finer instincts and chivalrous promptings of a cultured soul. No, there is no absolute justice, for to him fell that wonder of womanhood, Vesta Van Worden. The grievousness of this you will never understand, my grandsons, for you are yourselves primitive little savages, unaware of aught else but savagery. Why should Vesta not have been mine? I was a man of culture and refinement, a professor in a great university. Even so, in the time before the plague, such was her exalted position, she would not have designed to know that I existed. Mark, then, the abysmal degradation to which she fell at the hands of the chauffeur. Nothing less than the destruction of all mankind had made it possible that I should know her, look in her eyes, converse with her, touch her hand, and love her and know that her feelings toward me were very kindly. I have reasons to believe that she, even she, would have loved me, there being no other man in the world except the chauffeur. Why, when it destroyed 8 billions of souls, did not the plague destroy just one more man, and that man's chauffeur? Once, when the chauffeur was away fishing, she begged me to kill him. With tears in her eyes, she begged me to kill him. But he was a strong and violent man, and I was afraid. Afterwards, I talked with him. I offered him my horse, my pony, my dogs, all that I possessed, if he would give Vesta to me. And he grinned in my face and shook his head. It was very insulting. He said that in the old days he had been a servant, had been dirt under the feet of men like me and of women like Vesta, and that now he had the greatest lady in the land to be servant to him and cook his food and nurse his brats. You had your day before the plague, he said, but this is my day, and a damned good day it is. I wouldn't trade back for the old times for anything. Such words he spoke, but they're not his words. He was a vulgar, low-minded man, and vile oaths fell continually from his lips. Also, he told me that if he caught me making eyes at his woman, he'd wring my neck and give her a beating as well. Now, what was I to do? I was afraid. He was a brute. That first night when I discovered the camp, Vesta and I had great talks about the things of our vanished world. We talked of art, books, and poetry, and the chauffeur listened and grinned and sneered. He was bored and angered by our way of speech, which he did not comprehend. Finally, he spoke up and said, "And this is Vesta Van Worden, one-time wife of Van Worden the Magnate, a high and stuck-up beauty, who is now my squaw. Professor Smith? Times is changed. Times is changed. Here, you woman, take off my moccasins, and lively about it. I want Professor Smith to see how well I have you trained." I saw her clench her teeth, and the flame of revolt rise in her face. He drew back his gnarled fist to strike, and I was afraid and sick at heart. I could do nothing to prevail against him. So I got up to go and not be witness to such indignity. But the chauffeur laughed and threatened me with a beating if I did not stay and behold. And I sat there, perforce, by the campfire on the shores of Lake Temascal and saw Vesta Van Worden, kneel and remove the moccasins of that grinning, hairy, ape-like human brute. You don't understand, my grandsons. You've never known anything else, and you do not understand. Halter broke and bridle wise, the chauffeur gloated, while she performed that dreadful menial task. A trifle balky at times, Professor, a trifle balky, but a clout alongside the jaw makes her as meek and gentle as a lamb. And another time he said, we've got to start all over and replenish the earth and multiply. You're handicapped, Professor. You ain't got no wife, and you're up again a regular Garden of Eden proposition. But I ain't proud. I'll tell you what, Professor, he pointed at their little infant, barely a year old. There's your wife, though you'll have to wait till she grows up. It's rich, ain't it? We're all equals here, and I'm the biggest toad in the splash. But I ain't stuck up, not I. I do you the honor, Professor Smith, the very great honor of betrothing to you my and Vesta Van Worden's daughter. Ain't it cussed bad that Van Worden ain't here to see? Chapter 6. I lived 3 weeks of infinite torment there in the chauffeur's camp, and then, one day, tiring of me, or of what to him was my bad effect on Vesta, he told me that the year before, wandering through the Contra Costa Hills to the Straits of Carquinez, across the straits he had seen a smoke. That meant that there were still other human beings, and that for 3 weeks he had kept this precious information from me. I departed at once, with my dogs, my horses, and journeyed across the Contra Costa Hills to the straits. I saw no smoke on the other side, but at Port Costa discovered a small steel barge on which I was able to embark my animals. Old canvas, which I found, served me for a sail, and a southerly breeze fanned me across the straits and up to the ruins of Vallejo. And here, on the outskirts of the city, I found evidences of a recently occupied camp. Many clamshells showed me why these humans had come to the shores of the bay. This was the Santa Rosa tribe, and I followed its track along the old railroad right-of-way across the salt marshes to Sonoma Valley. Here at the old brickyard at Glen Ellen, I came upon the camp. There were 18 souls all told. 2 are old men, one of whom was Jones, a banker, and the other was Harrison, a retired pawnbroker, who had taken for wife the matron of the state hospital for the insane at Napa. Of all the persons of the city of Napa, and of all the other towns and villages in that rich and populous valley, she had been the only survivor. And next, there were 3 young men, Cardiff and Hale, who had been farmers, and Wainwright, a common-day laborer. All 3 had found wives. To Hale, a crude, illiterate farmer, had fallen Isidore, the greatest prize next to Vesta of the women who came through the plague. She was one of the world's most noted singers, and the plague had caught her at San Francisco. She had talked with me for hours at a time, telling me of her adventures, until at last, rescued by Hale in the Mendocino Forest Reserve, there had remained nothing for her to do but become his wife. But Hale was a good fellow in spite of his illiteracy. He had a keen sense of justice and right dealing, and she was far happier with him than Vesta was with the chauffeur. The wives of Cardiff and Wainwright were ordinary women, accustomed to toil with strong constitutions, just the type for the wild new life which they were compelled to live. In addition were 2 adult idiots from the feeble-minded home at Eldridge, and 5 or 6 young children and infants born after the formation of the Santa Rosa tribe. Also, there was Bertha. She was a good woman, Hare-Lip, in spite of the sneers of your father. Her I took for wife. She was the mother of your father, Edwin, and of yours, Hoo-Hoo. And it was our daughter, Vera, who married your father, Hare-Lip. Your father, Sandow, who is the oldest son of Vesta Van Worden and the chauffeur. And so it was that I became the 19th member of the Santa Rosa tribe. There were only 2 outsiders added after me. One was Mungerson, descended from the Magnates, who wandered alone in the wilds of Northern California for 8 years before he came south and joined us. He it was who waited 12 years more before he married my daughter Mary. And the other was Johnson, the man who founded the Utah tribe. That was where he came from, Utah, a country that lies very far away from here across the great deserts to the east. And not until 27 years after the plague that Johnson reached California. In all that Utah region, he reported but 3 survivors. Himself one, and all men. For many years these 3 men lived and hunted together until at last, desperate, fearing that with them the human race would perish utterly from the planet, they headed westward on the possibility of finding women survivors in California. Johnson alone came through the great desert, where his 2 companions had died. He was 46 years old when he joined us, and he married the 4th daughter of Isadore and Hale. And his eldest son married your aunt, Hare-Lip, who was the 3rd daughter of Vesta and Chauffeur. Now, Johnson was a strong man with a will of his own, and it was because of this that he seceded from the Santa Rosans and formed the Utah tribe at San Jose. It's a small tribe. There's only 9 in it, but though he is dead, such was his influence and the strength of his breed that it will grow into a strong tribe and play a leading part in the re-civilization of the planet. And there were only 2 other tribes that we know of, the Los Angelitos and the Carmelitos. The latter started from 1 man and 1 woman. He was called Lopez, and she was a descendant from the ancient Mexicans and was very dark-colored. He was a cowherd in the ranges beyond Carmel, and his wife was a maidservant in the great Del Monte Hotel. It was 7 years before we first got in touch with the Los Angelitos. They have a good country down there, but it's just too warm. I estimate the present population of the world at between 350 and 400, provided, of course, that there's no scattered little tribes elsewhere in the world. If there be such, we have not heard from them. Since Johnson crossed the desert from Utah, no word nor sign has come from the east or anywhere else. The great world in which we knew in my boyhood and early manhood is gone. It has ceased to be. I am the last man who was alive in the days of the plague and who knows the wonders of that far-off time. We, who mastered the planet, its earth, the sea, and the sky, and who were as very gods, now live in primitive savagery along the watercourses of this California country. But we are increasing rapidly. Your sister, Hare-Lip, already has 4 children. We are increasing rapidly and making ready for a new climb towards civilization. And in time, pressure of population will compel us to spread out. And 100 generations from now, we may expect our descendants to start across the Sierras, oozing slowly along generation by generation over the great continent to the colonization of the East. A new Aryan drift around the world. But it will be slow, very slow, but we have so far to climb. We fell so hopelessly far. If only 1 physicist or 1 chemist had survived. But it was not to be, and we have forgotten everything. The chauffeur started working in iron. He made the forge which we use to this day. But he was a lazy man. When he died, he took with him all he knew of metals and machinery. What was I to know of such things? I was a classical scholar, not a chemist. The other men who survived were not educated. Only 2 things did the chauffeur accomplish: the brewing of strong drink and the growing of tobacco. It was while he was drunk once that he killed Vesta. I firmly believe that he killed Vesta in a fit of drunken cruelty, though he always maintained that she fell into the lake and was drowned. And my grandsons, let me warn you against the medicine men. They call themselves doctors, travestying what was once a noble profession, but in reality they are medicine men, dirt devil men, and they make for superstitions and darkness. They are cheats and they are liars. But so debased and degraded are we that we believe their lies. They too will increase in numbers as we increase, and they will strive to rule us. Yet are they liars and charlatans. Look at young Cross-Eyes, posing as a doctor, selling charms against sickness, giving good hunting, exchanging promises of fair weather for good meat and skins, and sending the death stick, performing 1,000 abominations. Yet I say to you that when he says he can do these things, he lies. I, Professor Smith, Professor James Howard Smith, says that he lies. I have told him so to his teeth. Why he has not sent me to the death stick? Because he knows that with me it is without avail. But you, Hare-Lip, so deeply are you sunk in black superstition that did you awake this night and find the death stick beside you, you would surely die. And you would die not because of any virtues in the stick, but because you are a savage with the dark and clouded mind, savage. The doctor must be destroyed, and all that was lost must be discovered over again. Wherefore, earnestly, I repeat unto you certain things which you must remember, and tell to your children after you. You must tell them that when water is made hot by fire, there resides in it a wonderful thing called steam, which is stronger than 10,000 men and which can do all man's work for him. There are other very useful things. In the lightning flash resides a similarly strong servant of man, which was of old his slave and which someday will be his slave again. Quite a different thing is the alphabet. It is what enables me to know the meaning of fine markings, whereas you boys know only rude picture drawings. In that dry cave on Telegraph Hill, where you see me so often go when the tribe is down by the sea, I have stored many books. In them is great wisdom, and also with them I have placed a key to the alphabet, so that one who knows picture writing may also know print. And some day men will read again, and then, if no accident has befallen my cave, and they will know that Professor James Howard Smith once lived and saved for them the knowledge of the ancients. There is another little device that men inevitably will discover. It is called gunpowder. It was what enabled us to kill surely and at long distances certain things which are found in the ground, when combined in the right proportions, will make this gunpowder. What these things are, I've forgotten, or else I never knew. But I wish I did know. Then I would make powder, and then I would certainly kill Cross-Eyed and rid the land of superstition. After I am man-grown, I am going to give Cross-Eyes all the goats and meat and skins I can get, so that he'll teach me to be a doctor, Hoo-Hoo asserted. And when I know, I'll make everybody else sit up and take notice. They'll get down in the dirt to me, you bet. The old man nodded his head solemnly and murmured, Strange. Strange it is to hear the vestiges and remnants of the complicated Aryan speech falling from the lips of a filthy little skin-clad savage. All the world is topsy-turvy, and it has been topsy-turvy ever since the plague. You won't make me sit up, Hare-Lip boasted to the would-be medicine man. If I paid you for a sending of a death stick and it didn't work, I'd bust in your head. Understand, you hoo-hoo, you? I'm going to get Granzer to remember this here gunpowder stuff, Edwin said softly. And then I'll have you all on the run. You, Hare-Lip, will do my fighting for me and get my meat for me. And you, Hoo-Hoo, will send the death stick for me and make everybody afraid. And if I catch Hare-Lip trying to bust your head, Hoo-Hoo, I'll fix him with that same gunpowder. Granzer ain't such a fool as you think, and I'm going to listen to him, and someday I'll be boss over the whole bunch of you. The old man shook his head sadly and said, The gunpowder will come. Nothing can stop it. The same old story over and over. Man will increase, and man will fight. The gunpowder will enable men to kill millions of men, and in this way only, by fire and blood, will a new civilization, in some remote day, be evolved. And of what profit will it be? Just as the old civilization passed, so will the new. It may take 50,000 years to build, but it will pass. All things pass. Only remain cosmic forces and matter, ever in flux, ever acting and reacting and realizing the eternal types, the priest, the soldier, and the king. Out of the mouths of babes comes the wisdom of all the ages. Some will fight, Some will rule, some will pray, and all the rest will toil and suffer sore while on their bleeding carcasses is reared again and yet again without end the amazing beauty and surpassing wonder of the civilized state. It were just as well that I destroyed those cave-stored books. Whether they remain or perish, all their old truths will be discovered. Their old lies lived and handed down. What is the profit? Hare-Lip leapt to his feet, giving a quick glance at the pasturing goats in the afternoon sun. Gee, he muttered to Edwin, the old geezer gets more long-winded every day. Let's pull for camp. While the other two, aided by the dogs, assembled the goats and started them for the trail through the forest, Edwin stayed by the old man and guided him in the same direction. And when they reached the old right-of-way, Edwin stopped suddenly and looked back. Hare-Lip and Hoo-Hoo and the dogs and the goats passed on. Edwin was looking at a small herd of wild horses which had come down on the hard sand. There were at least 20 of them, young colts and yearlings and mares, led by a beautiful stallion which stood in the foam at the edge of the surf, with arched neck and bright wild eyes, sniffing the salt air from off the sea. What is it? Ganser queried. Horses, was the answer. First time I ever seen 'em on the beach. It's the mountain lions getting thicker and thicker and driving 'em down. The low sun shot red shafts of light, fan-shaped, up from a cloud-tumbled horizon. And close at hand, in the white waste of shore-lashed waters, the sea lions, bellowing their old primeval chant, hauled up out of the sea on the black rocks and fought and loved. Come on, Ganser, Edwin prompted. An old man and boy, skin-clad and barbaric, turned and went along the right-of-way into the forest in the wake of the goats. Well, that's an interesting story to ponder for a while. And while I ponder, let me find some more of that drink for my coffee, and there it is. Now, somebody else want to tell a story? Do so. Or you can send it on in to me, and we just might read it here. Look forward to that. You know, I got some more stories for you, but I'll tell them to you next time I see you. And until then, take care of yourselves. This is Clay Steele. Good night.